Writing great verse takes discipline. Contrary to what most teachers in creative writing class will tell you, it is not simply a matter of spontaneous self-expression. You have to master the forms if you want to do more than just write lazy, sloppy, unmemorable verse. And while this is not easy, it's also not impossible. In fact, I would argue that it's not unreasonably difficult to do this on a basic level. And for writing poetry in English, you can do no better than to take the advice of James Sale, who says,
Practice, practice, practice writing in iambic meter. 90% of all great poetry in the English language is written in this meter.
Iambic pentameter is the native form of English poetry and is essential for writing sonnets. It has a natural rhythm that mimics the sound of a heartbeat. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. This is the pattern known as an iamb, consisting of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Relief, agree, you get the point. And the pentameter is a line of verse with 5 iambs, making up 10 syllables in total. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. When I enunciate it like that, you can hear the rhythmic pattern there. One very common mistake that amateur poets do is that they're not thinking of the pentameter line in terms of stresses, they're just thinking about it in terms of syllables. And while English poetry is kind of a blend of accentual syllabic poetry, that is, the syllable is important, but the accent is also important, they tend to not focus on the accent at all. And while strict iambic pentameter follows this unstressed, stressed pattern, poets often vary the meter slightly for emphasis or for variety. Most of your standard metrical variations occur in the beginning and end of the line, so here's a few different common variations you can use to keep your line dynamic. The most common is the trochaic inversion in the first foot. So in the first foot of a line, you can reverse the iambic pattern. You can start with a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed one, and this is called a trochee, or the opposite of an iamb. An example of this is the line from John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south. That O opens the line with a strong stress. And something else is happening here too at the end of the line. The is in the position of the strong beat, but it's clearly a weak stressed syllable, so you glide over it. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south. Of and the make up a pyrrhic, a foot with no stresses, and warm south is a spondee, a beat of 2 stresses. Together, the pyrrhic and the spondee make up what is called a double iamb, 2 unstressed beats followed by 2 stressed beats. And so we can see here that Keats has put 2 metrical variations into one line, which an English teacher would probably tell you not to do, because more than one metrical variation per line tends to dilute the iambic pentameter too much. But this is Keats, so he can get away with it. So we talked about trochaic inversions in the first foot, but you can also have a trochaic inversion in the fourth foot. To be or not to be, that is the question. This adds emphasis at a crucial point in the line, that. Often when this happens, as in this case, there is a comma between the third and the fourth foot, which gives a slight pause and prepares the reader for the inversion. Now this line is also doing something else. It ends with question. It has a feminine ending, an extra weak syllable at the end. Often when this happens, it will be paired with a trochaic inversion at the beginning of the next line. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, etc. And doing this trochaic inversion at the beginning of the next line after having a feminine ending creates a nice sense of flow between them. As for other types of metrical variations, it is also sometimes acceptable to just chop off the first unstressed syllable of a line. The most famous example of this is probably Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forest of the night. If this had been a perfectly trochaic line, tiger, tiger, burning brightly, it just wouldn't have the same effect. It's also acceptable to add an extra unstressed syllable to the first foot, or to the fifth foot, and this is called an anapestic substitution. An anapest being a metrical foot of two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed one. Ba-ba-bum. So an example of this would be the following line. To each the boulders that have fallen to each. That line is from Robert Frost's Mending Wall, and that fallen to each at the end is not perfectly iambic. The last three syllables form an anapest. Now, iambic meter is a funny thing. One characteristic it has is that it sometimes forces words that are naturally dactylic into an iambic meter, and this is the case with Greek and Latin words. So, Aristotle, for example, is naturally pronounced Aristotle. There's only one stress, but in a pentameter line it becomes Aristotle. It takes two stresses, and the reason for this is that otherwise there's just no place for it in the line, since it has three unstressed syllables in a row. And sometimes there can be some ambivalence in a scansion because of this. Now here's an exercise. Let's consider the immortal lines. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. In that second line, Juliet, the et is in that strong position. So you're tempted to say, than this of Juliet. But then you have this and her that comes after Juliet. There's an extra weak syllable in the middle of the line. If you were reading this and it weren't written by Shakespeare, this is something an English teacher would probably red pen. Because an anapestic substitution in the middle of the line makes the scansion ambiguous. Maybe you pronounce the naturally dactylic Juliet as iambic, making it parallel with Romeo, which is also naturally dactylic but is forced into an iambic position. Romeo. So you say, Juliet and her Romeo. Now, if you say it this way, the and her would be an anapestic substitution. But you could also pronounce the Juliet as dactylic, not iambic, and stress the and instead. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. You see how you could do that? Again, doesn't matter if you're reading it silently, but if you're an actor, the emphasis matters. And this is why you do not put a dactylic word next to an anapestic substitution in the middle of the line without a comma, because it's confusing. I would say that when I've seen movie versions of this, the and does tend to be stressed. And I'm thinking of the Baz Luhrmann adaptation with DiCaprio.
For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
Another common thing that you encounter that's ambiguous is that when you encounter three unstressed syllables in a row, the middle syllable will tend to become stressed, even though it's an unimportant word. And while this is going to be inevitable sometimes, I would caution that you should strive to place the unimportant words in the line, prepositions, definite clauses, etc., the words that serve a grammatical function. These words should occupy the unstressed position whenever possible, and save the stressed position for the substantive words, the nouns and the verbs. An exception to this is when you want to stress a preposition because of its meaning rather than its grammatical function. The most famous example of this is when Macbeth says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, which brilliantly emphasizes the fatigue of eternity that Macbeth is feeling when he gives this soliloquy. Now, the flip side of the three unstressed syllables rule is the three stressed syllables rule. That is, when you have three heavy syllables in a row, you tend to de-stress the middle syllable, although it still has the effect of making the line heavy. In fact, having a lot of monosyllables in your line is going to slow the scansion down and might even sometimes make it a bit confusing as to how to scan the line. Robert Frost employs this to brilliant effect in his poem, I have been one acquainted with the night. So the first stanza reads, I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain, and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. This is a terza rima sonnet, a la Shelley. The poem is about walking, and the monosyllables in the poem give it a very plodding quality. The third stanza begins, I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet. Now it's a bit ambiguous here. You could read this as a normal pentameter line. I think you could make the case, though, that Frost is employing a double iamb here in the beginning, in I have stood still. 2 unstressed syllables, then the 2 stresses of stood still. That stood in the down position is just a very heavy word, and so it's just more natural to emphasize stood over have. And the language mirrors the subject matter. Frost is standing still, and you're standing still a little bit as you're scanning this poem. But in any case, whether you stress have a little more than stood, or vice versa, the line still has a slow tempo. One other point. If you're going to employ inversions, I would say that you should vary your inversions from line to line. That is, don't employ more than 1 inversion per line, but also don't employ the same inversion in consecutive lines. Like, don't have a trochaic inversion in the first foot for 3 straight lines. You do 1 in the first foot, then 1 in the fourth foot, then a regular line, then a double iamb, then an anapestic substitution, then cut out the first weak syllable. So this has been just a very basic crash course in meter and form. And so the next question is, you're ready to write your sonnet. What are you going to write your sonnet about? With Lantini and Petrarch and Shakespeare, all of these sonnets that they write are about romantic love. Usually disappointment in love. And I have to confess that I've written a handful of sonnets myself, and that they are all about this. Mostly I'm a narrative poet, and it seems that when I'm not in the throes of some romantic disappointment, I have very little lyric poetry to write about. But you should not follow my example. In his book on how to write classical poetry, Evan Mantic has a good piece of advice about sonnets. He says, when you're writing a sonnet, you should pick a topic that's something you really like. Now that might seem obvious, but it isn't necessarily. Don't just write about love because you feel like you have to write about love. Sonnets are a great way to develop a feeling or an idea you have about something. And if, for example, you have some idea that you've been carrying around for years, rolling it around in your head, it might serve you well to work that in or make it a topic. So that's one way to approach your subject matter. Now I'm going to be dropping an interview soon with a poet who actually does not think this way. He doesn't necessarily think that you need to start out with an idea when you're writing at all. Nicholas Korn has written 700 sonnets and has a very unique approach in terms of both his writing methods and the uniqueness of the form itself. He has developed a new structure for the sonnet that has never been done before. And so next time I'm going to be talking about what that is and focusing on his craft. So stay tuned. Thank you.